Heel hartelijk welkom bij deze bijeenkomst van de alumni-kring van de UvA Antieke Cultuur. Mijn naam is Irene de Jonge en ik ben een van de bestuursleden. And I will switch into English because of one of our distinguished guests. Well, the topic tonight, you can see it here, is a very hot topic. There is a sudden surge or even a hype in female or feminist rewritings of ancient myths. This is an intriguing phenomenon in itself. The rewriting of Greek mythology is, of course, as old as Greek mythology itself. This happened all the time. But the last 2 decades, there is really a surge. And this is intriguing, and it's our first speaker, Jacqueline Klooster, who is assistant professor of classics at the University of Groningen, but also an alumna of the UvA. She was so intrigued by this phenomenon that she has decided to write a book about it. So she will be our first speaker, and she will give a kind of overview and her ideas about how we can explain this. And then we are very excited that we also have Natalie Haynes, who is one of these female rewriters of ancient mythology. She was trained as a classicist in Cambridge. She did all kinds of other things. I just looked at your CV, which is quite interesting. But at some point, and maybe you will tell about this, when you decided to do these kind of things, to do these rewritings, to write novels, and also studies, Pandora's Jar, for instance. And you're very successful in doing this. Your books sell well. They also sell well in Holland. They are even translated. And afterwards, you can all buy either English or Dutch versions. So it's very interesting to see, to hear your perspective on why you do this, and perhaps on a larger scale, why you think this is happening so often at the moment. And you see that I've never seen Spuif 25 so full as it is today. So that's quite interesting. So there is something in this topic that attracts lots of people. I will stop now. Both speakers have about 30 minutes. Then we have, and they will speak directly after each other. There will not be an intermission, no questions. Afterwards, we have some 15, 20 minutes for questions, discussions, and then you can buy books, and perhaps Natalie is so kind to sign them, I don't know, but you can try. So I will withdraw now and give the floor to Jacqueline.
Okay, so thank you for the introduction, Irene, and thank you for inviting me as the support act here today, which is really quite an honor. And I was already saying to friends how interesting it is for a classicist to be able to actually interact with the authors you study. So that's, it's a real occasion for me. Okay, so today, I wanted to talk about this phenomenon of these rewritings. And these 2 pictures, I think, tell about the whole story. This was what I had this summer, because when I started thinking about looking into this phenomenon, and this is now, and this is also with lots of Amazon orders still in the post. So, I mean, there's a lot. And you can see also, it's really... I took the starting point 2005. You could, of course, go earlier. And I'm sure this isn't everything yet. But this is basically what I've found so far in the last couple of years. And you can see it's really picking up pace. So what are we talking about here? And, of course, if you are a scholar, you always need to set your parameters a bit. So what I wanted to look at for this book, and I'm sure I'm going to broaden the scope up, because I do find the phenomena which are related also very interesting. So I'm looking at retellings of myth which are set in mythical times with more or less the same plot and characters as the original myths. And of course, there are often new characters introduced, some kind of sidekicks of the main characters and so on. But so I'm not really looking at what is also something which is very popular. Mythical stories, mythical themes, but set in our modern world. So not retellings set in the ancient world. And then, of course, yeah, there's this third category, which I'm also interested in, but I'm not entirely sure what to make of it, which are very obviously mythical retellings, but they are not set in antiquity, nor really, let's say, in our world, so more kind of a fantasy setting. So that's basically the kind of thing I'm looking at. So what I want to talk about to you today in this half hour is how new this phenomenon is, and Irene already said something about, well, rewriting of myth is, of course, as old as myth itself. So how does retelling and rewriting work? Why and how does it work? And why is this female perspective now so prominent? And how feminist can we say that it is? And why is this happening now? And what might be happening next? So, yeah, to illustrate my first point that mythical retellings have always existed, I just printed here some covers of books which are clear examples of this phenomenon. You could actually say that the tragedians of 5th century Athens were people who reworked Homeric myth. And of course, Ovid is a very interesting example of rewriting of myth in ancient world, because he already chooses the female perspective. So in his letters of heroines, he chooses the Penelope perspective or the Helen perspective, for instance, rather than the perspective of the males. So, and of course, Dictys and Dares, sorry, is also a kind of late antique retelling of the Trojan myth. And even in, let's say, 20th century literature, retellings are very frequent. I pasted a lot of covers here, and a lot of them are from early 20th century. And I have to say that I was inspired by a specific book on retellings, which, as you can probably tell, was French, because many of the covers I've printed here are French retellings. So novels based on the Odyssey, novels based on the tragedians, and so on and so forth. So also that's nothing new. So is the female perspective new? Also not entirely, maybe. I mean, you can tell, you can see here there is some of it going on already in the 80s, especially focus here on the classical myths. And of course, Margaret Atwood, whom you probably also know from The Handmaid's Tale, wrote the Penelopiad. Ursula Le Guin, a writer of science fiction, also tried her hand at this retelling about the bride of Aeneas. And so, yeah, this is something which has been going on for a while. But I would say that it's different now, and I'll come to that later. What's also interesting is that it's not only classical myth that gets retold from this female perspective. I have some examples here of other canonical works or canonical stories which get retold. So, for instance, White Sargasso Sea. I don't know if anybody knows this, what it's a retelling of. It's Jane Eyre, of course, where the mad woman in the attic, the first Mrs. Rochester, gets to tell her side of the story, basically. That's what it is. And interestingly enough, there's also, let's say, a post-colonial perspective to this, because the first Mrs. Rochester came from the Dominican islands. The second one is also really interesting. It's an Italian novel, and it's based on Lolita by Nabokov. So it's the story of Lolita as told by Lolita. And what was interesting about this, of course, Jane Eyre could never sue Jean Rhys for writing this novel, but the son of Vladimir Nabokov actually started a lawsuit against Pia Pera, the novelist of this book, and eventually even got to write the introduction to this, to the English version of this novel, and she had to pay all the revenues to him because it was an infringement of copyright, according to him. I find that very horrible, but well, that's what happened. And of course, you can see that. So, but what you see basically is that it's things that are in the canon, stories which are in the canon, which are very well known and which attract these rewritings. Other examples, a very recent one, I haven't read it yet, The Defeat of Gilgamesh, apparently also a female perspective rewriting of the Gilgamesh epic. Lear Wife, which also a very interesting reimagining of the story of King Lear, where, of course, the wife of King Lear is very much absent in Shakespeare's version. She gets to tell what happened to her in this book. And there are also a great deal of retellings from other mythological traditions. And I only give you one here, which is from the Chinese, which is about the beginning of the Ming dynasty. But there are many others. So it's something which is picking up speed, which is interesting. And why is it different? Well, I would say for starters, the sheer numbers are really, well, overwhelming, I would say. And the popularity is also really interesting because you have these, previously you have these one or two retellings which are highbrow literary books, and this is for a very broad audience, I would say. However, it's not only novels. I mean, you also get poetry collections, theater productions, memes, webtoons on the internet. It's all over the place. It's really all over the place. Instagram poetry, everything. Many of the major authors have a background in classics, I found. And one example is sitting here. As you, what also happens, and what I think is related to what's happening here, is that there's a lot of fan fiction retellings about mythology. And I don't know if everyone here, I'm looking not at the younger people, but knows what fan fiction is. But it's basically that you can write a story based on a very well-known character in which you imagine, for instance, an emotional relationship which this person has with someone you would like to see that person with. So it's called shipping, I've been told by my daughter. And that's also happening a lot. And if you look at numbers of mythology rewritings in these Archive of Our Own and other web-based sites, it's amazing. It's in the thousands. Somebody is also writing a PhD on this now, I think in Nijmegen, so that's also going to be interesting. Besides the female perspectives, you also find other perspectives, so the queer perspective, for instance, or the trans perspective in the song, in the Wrath Goddess Sing by Maya Dean, and the queer perspective in Song of Achilles. And I think, I mean, we probably cannot deny that the internet and the way that targets specific reading groups plays a role in this. And I think that's, well, why not? It's a good thing. So how does retelling work? How does rewriting work? And this is like a little bit the academic part of my talk, I would say. So I read Jeannette, Palimpsest. That was the French book I was referring to earlier. And he has this very nice structuralist. He puts everything in boxes and says, okay, this is how it works. So for instance, yeah, I was, okay, no problem. So what he says is you can, for instance, make a story different by modifying the actions of the plot, and he calls that pragmatic transposition. For instance, in this amazing book, Wrath Goddess Sing, where Achilles is a trans woman who gets pregnant with Agamemnon's baby. And that's something I didn't see coming. It's a really quite a wild ride, I would say. But afterwards, I was teaching epic, and then I was thinking, why? It's so weird to say he now, you know, because I was getting used to Achilles as a she. Anyway, so it's based, of course, on the story that Achilles was on the of Kyros and dressed as a girl to avoid going to war. Okay, so that's one thing. You can change the plot. You can also, and that's probably what happens more, and this is really a standout, I would say, you change the motivation of the characters. You introduce a new motivation. You say, there's no motivation for why they did something in the original story, but you provide one, or you change it, or you suppress it. So, for instance, in Circe, why did Circe change men into pigs? That's not something that's really explained in the Odyssey. But if you give her a backstory where there's a reason for that, then it becomes a different story altogether. And the whole element of changing men into pigs also becomes meaningful in a different way. Transvaluation is related. You change the implicit valuation of actions, feelings, or attitudes of characters, often by changing the perspective. So, for instance, The Silence of the Girls does that very strongly by telling what happened in the Trojan War, telling what Achilles did, what Agamemnon did, by focusing through the eyes of Briseis. So why is that done? Well, it's a kind of a self-evident thing, I would say, but what does it do? And Liedeke Plaat, who's a professor at Nijmegen, again, she has this book, Transforming Memories in Contemporary Women's Rewriting, and she says, and I think she's right, it's about writing back to the center. And she quotes... oh, okay. So I need to start again. Yes, I'll just start again. Okay, okay. No, but what she says is writing back to the center. She quotes Salman Rushdie. So what happens is that the people who are in the periphery, who are the minorities, they take these famous stories and they give their perspective. They write back, as it were. And that's, I could say, that's really what happens, I think. And why do they do so? Well, because often these minorities are not in the history books, but they can, in this way at least, take their place or reconquer their place in the cultural memory by writing themselves into it, as it were. But what that does, of course, is a bit paradoxical, because while it challenges the great stories and the great books and the great myths, at the same time, they also confirm the canonicity of these myths and these books and these stories and the plots in them as well. And that's not often, sometimes that's not what people want. And an interesting thing about that I found was a quote Liedeke Plaat gives of Christoph Wolff, the Eastern German writer who wrote a Cassandra and a Medea novel. And she said, when I read Aeschylus, when I read the last words of Cassandra before she goes inside the palace to get killed by Clytemnestra, what she says is, I will now go inside and lament my own fate and that of Agamemnon. And Christoph Wolff said, and that of Agamemnon? No way. Cassandra would never have said that. Cassandra, as I know her, she wouldn't have said that. That cannot be true. I am going to correct this, as if it were an actual historical story. So that's an interesting thing about these rewritings, and people feel strongly. Indeed, that's what you can find also in the rhetoric on the covers. It's always a story of revealing, of recovering, of setting straight, as you can see, people who were silenced, people who were lost, and so forth. So that's interesting. That's the feeling which belongs with these retellings, I would say. So does it matter, the female perspective? I think it does. And I found this an interesting quote by Lillian Doherty. She says, what difference, and she's very nuanced, I think, what difference does it make that nearly all surviving ancient versions of the myths are by male authors? Undeniably, a male poet is capable of portraying vivid female characters, making one of the protagonists of a work, or putting words in her mouth that express attitudes different from those the male characters think she should have. But when virtually all our testimony comes from men, however, we must ask if we are missing something important. There is a difference. I mean, there is a gap. There is something which gets lost in these stories. So that's what she says is the instigation for so many people to rewrite. And if you look at the nature of Greek myth, at the specific gendered patterns which are visible in Greek myth, and I find this a very interesting children's book, the gender-swapped Greek myths, then you will see that it's actually a thing. For instance, if you look at the cover of this book, it's Odysseia, so a woman who is sailing over the seas, and the male seductive sirens are trying to lure her and her women to their death. And it's always a bit funny to think of that. Or Zea, the divine, the mother of humankind, who is always running after pretty young men. And it's something which it shows you how the patterns work and how they how strongly embedded they are in the stories. And women often get portrayed in these stories in relation to men. They are the other, and that can be positive, that can be negative, but they are basically the other one, and that's probably what invites these retellings. So if you do that, is this female perspective automatically feminist? Well, of course, yes, in the sense that you reclaim a position in the canon, that you fill the gap, that you defy or change cultural memory by your stories, that you challenge a gender system which is still very much in the cultural canon, and that this change of perspective also invites new identification for new readers and also representation in the canon. And I found this a very interesting opposition. Stephen Fry is, of course, also very famous and very well liked for his rewritings. But if you look at these two covers, and this is the Dutch cover of the Pandora's jar, and there's another Pandora on Stephen Fry's jar, and Stephen Fry's Pandora is opening the jar and letting all the bad things out in the world, while here we have these two crowned women on the other thing. So I think that captures very nicely what that does, this retelling and this new focus on women. So who are the women whose stories get retold? Well, Medusa, for instance, and we'll hear more about that, I think, very soon, is of course a very clear feminist icon for obvious reasons. But also, and I think this is also quite a priceless, especially the middle picture, you let that thing sink in for a minute, is also very interesting. I have to thank Luc Huyting for this. He sent me this. But Clytemnestra is also really, really popular. There are also women who are not so often don't get their story retold so often because they're maybe even more problematic. But I just heard that one of them, who I always consider the most problematic but interesting for that reason, Medea, is probably going to get a novel of her own and a retelling of her own. Of course, you also have a related, or I don't know, is it related, phenomenon of retellings which, are very popular but maybe not so feminist in their specific retellings. I think this is more like 50 Shades of Greek Myths or something like that. But that's also a thing, and it's interesting. I think this is also related to fan fiction, probably. I have still to read this first book, but it's of course a very nice thing happening, but there are maybe also some problematic aspects of these retellings, because these myths are so strongly gendered. If you turn the tables, it's not the women who are always thought of as the other and who are always described in relation to the men, but it risks getting the men in that position and making them the toxic other, so the monster or the obstacle or whatever. Also, of course, it's always stories about queens, goddesses, nymphs, usually. So there needs to be, I think, a novel about the nurse of Medea, maybe also. And of course, a thing I already pointed out is that some of these plots really call out the gender patterns, which they wish to challenge, but at the same time reconfirm them. That's something which Liedeke Plaat already mentioned. And a question I often get is why, if you want to write a novel in which the gender patterns aren't stuck, why wouldn't you just create a new story altogether? Of course, that's something which you could do, but then it doesn't have the same standing, I suppose, and it doesn't challenge the canon in the same way. So that's also something to think about. So why on earth would you want to study the classics? And this is a question which has recently been put in a very interesting way. So the Greek tragedies happened ages ago. Are the things that happen in them still sad? Does classics still matter? Is it still interesting for us to look at? I would rephrase the question. Well, yes, I would say. So why are the classics so interesting for these rewritings? I think that's because they form such an inescapable part of the dominant cultural canon. I find it an interesting question whether that's more the case in the English-speaking world than here, because I haven't seen many Dutch rewritings yet, original rewritings. So maybe it's something to talk about later. Classics also, of course, has this standing, and it has this very clear-cut, gender-patterned, patterns. So that's also a reason why, I would say. But there are doubtless more reasons. And why does it happen now? It's also a question you could ask. I think it has to do with the fact that, especially in the English-speaking world again, I mean, it's happening here as well, but I think it wasn't felt as necessary as in the English-speaking world. The decolonializing of the classics is picking up speed as well. Of course, there's also all kinds of more wider social phenomena like Me Too and the observance of the still existent gender gap. Things you could mention also are popularity of myth in general, also in fantasy fiction, fan fiction. Maybe women are more readers now than men, I don't know. Pop feminism is of course also something, and of course the eternal value of myths. They remain good to think with, always about society, about society's problems. And that's really interesting that it's still, even these old stories remain, have their message for us. Okay, so whatever could happen next? A lot of people have been throwing at me, well, maybe the next thing is dogs. So the perspective of the animal. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that. It's a bit strange to say that that's the next thing. But I lined up these books because I thought they are interesting in a different take on this phenomenon. So, for instance, The Just City is a kind of fantasy fiction, science fiction novel based on Plato. If you can still follow me, that's really interesting. It's fascinating. Lies We Sing to the Sea is a rewriting of the Odyssey, but it's not, and it's written by somebody who says she hasn't read the Odyssey, and there was a lot of controversy around that as well. And that brings you to the question, whose are the classics and what do you need to know when you start rewriting? The Emperor's Babe is a lovely, charming prose poem about a Nigerian girl in the 2nd century in York who becomes the lover of the emperor. So it broadens up the scope a bit, I would say, of the Greco-Roman world. It's not a retelling, obviously. And I found this last one also interesting. I haven't yet read it, but it's about women and men. So it pairs women and men. And I think that's kind of a way of trying to get to, let's say, a solution or something maybe. Anyway, there are, of course, more questions I would like to answer in my research into this, and who knows, maybe some of them might get answered today. But I'll leave it at this, and I look forward to hearing what you might ask me later on. But first, I think we give the floor to Natalie now. Thanks.
Do you want me to use the podium for your camera? Because otherwise I don't have anywhere to put this Diet Coke, which is a bit traumatic. Sorry. So I'm staying in a hotel room, which is like a tiny cupboard, a tiny hot cupboard, and there's literally not a single flat surface on it apart from the bed. So every time I go to drink a glass of water, I'm like, no, I'll just carry it around. And I've now started doing that in the rest of my life. So hopefully this will be a thing that follows. So I think there are probably a whole bunch of questions I need to answer. And we should probably start with the simplest one, which is why I'm doing it, because that's the only one I can really authoritatively answer, I suppose. Other questions like why now and why everything else are secondary. Don't take that Diet Coke, seriously. I mean it. I need that caffeine. I don't drink hot drinks, just, so there's no coffee in my life. Diet Coke is it. So you have to really, neck it in order to catch up. So the answer is that I've been studying classics for so long, I can't really remember what it was like not to have done so. I started Latin at 12 and Greek at 14. I took triple classics A-levels, so the exams you take when you're 18 in the UK. I took Latin, Greek, and ancient history, and then my degree is in classics. So this is really the only thing I'm qualified to do pretty well. And so I was always going to write about classics one way or another. For a long time, I was a stand-up comedian in the UK and sometimes elsewhere. And there was always kind of sneaking bits of classics, but not very much because it wasn't a very classics-friendly audience in the 1990s when I was starting out. And then I started to write for newspapers, and I wrote a piece for the Times, the London Times, for whom I had a weekly column for about 5 years. When Gordon Brown became Prime Minister in the UK, they said, can you tell us which Roman emperor he was most like? And I was like, sure. Made something up like journalists do, sorry, and handed it in. And then it was one of those pieces that got debate going for weeks afterwards in the letters page. Dear the editor, Ms. Haynes appears to believe. And so, but it was fun. And so I wrote a book off the back of that called The Ancient Guide to Modern Life. And then the short answer to why the novels set in the ancient world are kind of predominating at the moment is because people are buying them. And the reason that that is happening is because the vast majority of fiction is bought by women and read by women. The vast majority of it. Generally, women will buy books by anyone, and men tend to buy books by men. These aren't exclusive categories, but that tends to be the case. But women buy a lot more fiction either way than men do. So there's always a market to cater to women readers. And for the longest time, I think, publishers just kind of assumed that that wasn't true when it came to things like historical fiction. And I'm not sure really what to call this. My friend Sarah, Professor Churchwell, calls it counter-mythical, which I really like. So maybe we'll stick with that, where you re-examine a myth and tell it from a different perspective. But for a long time, it was believed that there simply wouldn't be an audience to do this. And I can tell you that because I changed both agents and publishers between writing my first novel, which is set in the modern world, in Edinburgh and in London, in Scotland and then in England. And that was published in 2014 in the UK, and I think maybe a year or two later here. But if you've read it, you deserve some kind of medal, because I think about 5 people did. And I'm related to fully 4 of those people who are Flemish and were just buying the Dutch copy to be, loyal. So then I began to write a book that would be eventually called The Children of Jocasta. But when I wrote it, it was called The Reckoning. But we weren't allowed to call it that because for a very long time, it was the case that if you wrote books with women in them, you sort of had to have women in the title so that women, and I know how ditzy you all are, wouldn't go into a shop and be kind of bamboozled by long words. But would instead go in and go, oh, this has a lady's name in, it must be for me. And so I said, can we call it The Reckoning? And everyone went, no. Oh, okay. But I had to change agents and publishers over The Children of Jocasta. I wrote it out of contract, so I wrote the whole, 90,000 words. And then my publisher for Amber Fury didn't want it. And then nor did anyone else. And my agent at the time, he would take like weeks to read it, a draft, and then, he'd come back and be like, I'm not sure. And it's like, I'm pretty sure it's good. You know, it's my version of the Theban saga, so the story of Oedipus, but re-centered around Jocasta and also Ismene, the younger daughter. And that's quite an unusual myth to center on a different person, because obviously there's already Antigone. The most famous part of that next-gen story is Antigone's. But I thought I would go for the, you know, quieter sister, mainly because she has like 60 lines in Sophocles. And I was like, oh, come on. She's right there witnessing all of this, and she's still alive at the end, spoiler. So, you know, come on. So it seemed reasonable to me. But I had to change. I mean, it went to everyone before Pan Macmillan, you know, changed it, because I changed agents over it. And so it turned around. And then I would like to tell you that this was all a kind of super easy path, but 1,000 Ships was offered to like every single publisher in America, and they all said no to it. I mean, I'm pretty confident that for a while, you know, when you go for a job interview and at the end they say, is there anything you'd like to ask or comment on? I think you had to say, if you were going for a job in American publishing, oh, can I just assure you, I definitely won't buy Natalie Haynes' novel 1,000 Ships. And then they'll go, yes, you've got the job. Because it was turned out by like 30 people. And then it was shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction in the UK. And then it was bought by a brilliant and visionary woman named Erin in the US. And then, you know, like a year later, it was the best-selling audiobook in America for a month. It's like, tell me again how there's no audience, because these people haven't got your memo, huh? And so the answer to why now and why so many is because now the people who want to read these books there's no block between those readers and the writers. So we can just, I always knew that, you know, and I don't want to go too radical and quote Beauvoir at you, but I always knew that women were the same thing as people. And so did readers. You know, honestly, it was publishing that took a while to catch up, which is weird because lots of people who work in publishing are women. It's a female-dominated industry, but the money and the people who are at the very top of the industry are largely not women. And so I think it just took a bit of time for there to be an acceptance that these books would find a readership. And it took a bit of time for those readers to be able to make their voices heard. It's much, much easier now because of things like Bookstagram and BookTok for young women to say, we really like this, could we have more of it, please? And that, I mean, it seems to me it's a kind of, across the board, generally, young women's voices are being heard in terms of their desires as consumers, which isn't in any regard what I would like their whole lives to be. But in terms of their desires as consumers, they are now much more able to be heard than they were before. For the longest time, you know, if you went and bought clothes, then what you got was what Cynthia Highmore, the brilliant humorist, American humorist and journalist, once called clothes for small men. And, you know, and that's okay. I still dress a bit like somebody in a lesbian grunge band from the 90s. So I'm obviously fine with that. But for a lot of people, you know, you went into shops and the clothes did look like they were just men's clothes, but designed for women's bodies. And then suddenly, when Instagram happened, there were bright colours everywhere. And it's like, oh, it turns out you didn't all want to wear navy and grey all the time. It's like, oh, no, actually not. Thanks. And I honestly feel that this is one long kind of continuum, because the same thing has happened with books. There was this suggestion that essentially everyone read children's books, but only really children's books with male protagonists were being published. You know, that there are plenty of furious studies about the minuscule number of female protagonists and protagonists of colour in children's books, which is, again, only just starting to change. And then there was a sort of assumption that eventually people would diverge and that girls would read chick lit and boys would read, I don't know, those things with men who used to be in the SAS or something, and probably are eating, like, bugs in a jungle or something like that. And it was like, well, that's what everyone is interested in. It's like, I literally don't know a single person who falls into these categories, so I don't understand how the categories have happened. And it turned out that, you know, there's that thing where you go, well, maybe I'm just in a media bubble and everyone I know isn't interested. No, it turned out literally no one was interested in maintaining those categories. As soon as the walls were kind of removed, then readers found texts that they wanted, and it didn't seem challenging at all. And now I can't tell you exactly the gender split of my readership. I can only tell you reasonably accurately the gender split of my social media following, because that's easier to say. And it goes about 70% female, 30% male. And I think in publishing, the idea that you would have as many as 30% men reading books which are centered around women, they're like, how has this happened? Yeah, I don't know. Would you feel better if I told you they're probably all gay? I don't know. It's fine. But it is a weird... We're all having to catch up, I think, with the fact that the readers were ahead of the publishing world and the writing world by quite some distance and by, a few years. But in some ways, we weren't ahead of ancient authors. In lots of ways, ancient... patriarchy and ancient misogyny were so comprehensive, you can't ever discuss anything from the ancient world without bearing it in mind as a sort of overarching societal structure. And yet, there are times when it kind of makes me catch my breath. This particularly happened to me when I was writing Pandora's Jar and its sequel, which will be out in the UK this autumn, but I think here probably next year, but I've lost track a bit. Is that the misogyny that we've kind of come to attribute to these stories as being ancient in origin is actually much, much later than that. It is a modern reiteration of misogyny or patriarchy that we're responding to. So when Ships came out in the UK, it also came out, the international edition came out in multiple English-speaking countries at a time, and I cannot remember either the nationality or the name of the journalist who asked me this question, so I'm not even protecting them, I've just forgotten. But when it came out, I did an interview on the radio, and this guy said, so isn't it a bit anachronistic to put women at the heart of the story of the Trojan War? And I said, well, if you look at the plays about the Trojan War, the tragedies of the Trojan War that have survived to us from Euripides, for example, we've got 8, and 7 of them have women as the title characters. So if it is anachronistic, you probably need to tell him, because I'm not sure he got your memo. And there was this sort of awkward silence, when you feel a bit like you've slapped somebody around on their own programme on live radio, and then you don't even feel very bad about it. You think, well, you started it, so... And so I think it's really interesting the way that we've, because of the kind of seriousness with which people take classics, and they should, they are hugely important texts, and you're right, our cultural capital is unimaginable without them. But we prioritise and have prioritised some texts over others, and there's not always a good reason for that. And that's to do with classical reception, i.e. the way we've responded to classics over the last couple of hundred years. It's not to do with our ancient sources, I don't think. So we consider Homer to be highest art because, I don't know, because it's one of the earliest. Is he better than Hesiod? I don't know. I've been reading Homer in Greek since I was 15. And I can't honestly tell you I think he's better than Euripides. I think he's different from Euripides. But somehow we centre, and even within Euripides, when I was an undergraduate, which I know is like thousands of years ago, but it's still the case, then the Bacchae, a really male-centred narrative that plays with gender critically and playfully, and then, brings in its female characters as a mighty, murderous chorus. That was still being studied a lot more than, for example, the Troades, the Trojan women. And likewise with Sophocles, you routinely saw sets of lectures on the Philoctetes or the Ajax, which centred on male experience in war, and yet much less interest in, the Electra. And you look at a writer like Euripides, and his understanding of the physicality of femaleness marks him out, in my view, as a revolutionary writer, both for his own time, but also for ours. So if we look at the same moment, or the same moment in the story of a character, in Jocasta's life, for example, she has 120 lines in Oedipus Tyrannus, Oedipus the King, the Sophocles play. So it's not very many. She's not, obviously Oedipus is the lead role. It does have his name in the title, although that doesn't always follow. Of course, Clytemnestra is the lead in the Agamemnon. But she's not even the second most important character. And yet, quite a lot does happen to her during the play. She gets fewer lines than her brother, Creon. And when she mentions to Oedipus that the baby she once had, spoiler alert, they are the same, was given away at 3 days old and so on and so on. She does it, it's like 2 lines in the Greek. There's no English translation that ever makes more of it than that, and nor should it, that's all that's there. And it's just kind of brisk information. She says, you shouldn't worry about what, prophets and soothsayers say. Oracles are meaningless if we can't understand them. She doesn't question the existence of the gods, but she does question their capacity to communicate with us or our capacity to comprehend it. So the gods are essentially on a different plane and there's no communication between us. And she hands over this information. The baby was taken from her. There's nothing to worry about, as though it were, a shopping list. It's just pragmatism, right? It gets the story. I mean, the structure of Oedipus Tyrannos is one of the most glorious, mesmerizing things in all of literature, in every language, frankly. It's like being punched in the face from both sides over and over again for 90 minutes and liking it. It's just incredible. But then if we look at her monologue, the monologue of the same character of Jocasta in Euripides, in the Phoenissae, the Phoenician women, we get something absolutely, to my mind, extraordinary. She delivers this opening monologue, and of course the fact that she's alive at all is already a revision. We've talked about the fact that, we're all retelling Greek myths. There's nothing else you can ever do with Greek myths. There isn't an original version. And that is the thing I spend probably more of my life saying on stage. Actually, there isn't one. Sorry, sir, there isn't one. Aeschylus called his plays slices from the banquet of Homer, we're told. And Homer was, multiple poets, almost certainly the Odyssey and Iliad were very unlikely to have been written by the same one person, or composed, I should say. It's much more likely that multiple oral traditions were being eventually squished into one overarching structure. And I would still argue that the overarching structure of the Iliad feels to me much more coherent than the structure of the Odyssey, where, let's remind ourselves, he does get home literally halfway through the poem, which is about coming home. I'm just saying, and the last 2 books, don't get me wrong, I love Homer, but I'm just saying there aren't those wasted words in Euripides, that's all I'm saying. So in this version of her story, Jocasta does not die at the moment when the truth of her marriage is revealed. So in the Sophocles version, the most famous version, of course, she discovers that her husband is also her son. She famously hangs herself, and then he takes the pins from her dress and blinds himself in an act of autoenucleation. And we tend to think that this must be the right version or the original version because it's the best known. And it's early, right? It's 5th century. What's to argue with it? Okay, well, let's go back to the Odyssey, to the Nicaea, where Odysseus goes down to the underworld, and he sees across a murky underworld, he sees Kalan Epikasten, beautiful Epicast. So Jocasta doesn't even have the same name here, right? And it's just 10 lines. He says, she, in ignorance, she married her son, and then when they found out, which happens immediately, so no children, it seems, in the Homeric version, she rushes down to Hades, i.e. she takes her own life, and he carries on ruling, carrying the laments of a woman or something. I forget the exact Greek. So in that version, it seems, the earliest version that we have, the earliest literary version that we have, it seems that Oedipus doesn't get banished. There's no mention of the blinding, which for us is probably the most famous bit of that story. But Jocasta does take her own life, and yet in the Euripides version, quite the reverse has happened, right? So this is set in the time after their marriage has been uncovered and the truth has been told. And yet Jocasta is still alive because she hasn't taken her own life. Instead, the shame has landed on Oedipus, not on Jocasta. He has basically been locked up in the palace of Thebes as a sort of terrible embarrassment to his sons, Eteocles and Polynices, who, spoiler again, are not going to survive to the end of this play. And Jocasta has taken on this sort of like diplomatic role. She's sort of like the queen mother or something like that. So she's trying to broker a peace deal between her sons, and unsuccessfully, as it turns out. But in this opening monologue, there she speaks about the loss of Oedipus as a baby. And she says, he was taken from me when he was just a couple of days old, and he was given to his adoptive mother, whose name is Merope, the queen of Corinth. And she says, and it's just the most extraordinary sentence to find in a text which is 2,500 years old. She says, she nursed the child my labour pains produced. What? Yep, what? there it is right there. This is a society that had wet nurses for women who were rich enough, and yet this woman knows the physical pain of having given birth to a child and then for that child to be nourished on another woman's body. It has obviously plagued her for decades. It's devastating when she says it. And you find yourself reading it thinking, how do you know? How did you know? How did you know that? You know, the idea that men would have been present at the births of their children seems pretty optimistic in terms of their new man status. You know, women, and particularly rich women, because we've been talking about intersectionality, and of course it's true in historical Athens, the Athens of these playwrights who are writing these myths just as much as within the myths themselves. So men's quarters and women's quarters would have been fully separate. It's really unlikely that Euripides would have been present at the birth of his children. He'd probably have been next door getting drunk on slightly diluted wine, and then somebody would come and say, ta-da, you've got a son, or you've got a daughter. And in the case of Euripides, I cannot help but have the belief that he would be like, yes, daughter. But that's because I'm incredibly biased, of course. But somehow, you know, who knows what kind of relationship he must have had with his wife, sister, mother, daughter, in order to know the kind of things that he feels able to write about. The opening monologue in his Medea was being read as a, you know, critique of the awfulness of women's lives under a patriarchal society. It was being read aloud at suffrage meetings in the UK about 110 years ago, as women were demanding the vote. It's like, because our lives are like this. A text that's 2,500 years old, written by a man, performed by a man, almost certainly to an audience just of men. It is extraordinary that these things exist. So I don't think Euripides had a problem with putting women at the center of the story. I think quite the reverse. He could see that if you wanted to write an epic about, for example, the Trojan War, then for sure you're going to stay on the battlefield, right? Because then you're going to have loads of characters, you know, fortunes rising and falling, lots of people dying, lots of action sequences, gods getting involved, people everywhere, blood everywhere, death everywhere. Yes, give me the Iliad, put it on the battlefield. But if you want drama, you need to come off the battlefield, right? Because you have to imagine that the war is basically one long action sequence, right? And so essentially nobody's character can develop when they're just, you know, what choices do you make in a moment of profound life or death conflict? Not very many. You know, that it's instinct. You're just battling to survive. Yet you come off the battlefield to the build-up to war, Iphigenia and Aulis, to the aftermath of the war, Troades, Hecabe. And this is where drama happens, because this is where choices are made. So when Hecabe decides to commit one of the most extraordinary revenges in all of theatre, let alone in Greek tragedy, when she discovers that her youngest son, the one they have sent away before the end of the war in secret with gold so that he'll survive, has in fact been murdered for the gold by the man that they trusted him to. The revenge she takes on him is fully extraordinary and dreadful. You know, she and her fellow survivors, now enslaved women, belonging to the Greeks, they take brooch pins, again, always a dangerous thing to have around, and they kill the children of the man who had killed her son, and then they blind him. So the last thing he will ever have seen is his children dying. Now that is a revenge, right? But again, it's a very gendered revenge. You don't imagine, you know, she is an old woman. She's theoretically had, you know, she's been sort of co-mother to 50 sons and daughters with Priam. So it's like, she probably had a difficult life, I'm thinking, if only for the lack of peace and quiet. But it seems to me a really interesting, again, way of reading this story that does seem to have a sense of what female bodies are capable of versus male bodies. Could this old woman have taken on a hugely powerful king with all his bodyguards? No. Not in terms of, you know, a battle on the battlefield. If you want that, you're going to have to read Penthesileia's story in Quintus Mannaeus' Fall of Troy, when the Amazons come to take to the battlefield at Troy. But Hecabe does something really different. She lulls someone into a false sense of security because she is an old woman, because she is invisible, because she is powerless and enslaved. And then she does something no one could ever have imagined a woman would do. And that's, it seems to me, fully playing on both her age and her gender and her status, her class status now, formerly a queen, now enslaved. So I guess I started this. This is what always happens when I try to talk to you about my books, and then I'm like, no, I've already lost interest. Let's talk about Euripides. It always goes that way. I think there's been a definite shift in the way that people perceive these stories, at least in part because of this recentering. But the recentering it's novel relative to the last 50 or 100 years, you know, but it's not particularly novel relative to our ancient sources. Euripides, as I say, never tired of putting women at the centre of the story. And then, of course, the same is true of Ovid. The Heroides is an extraordinary text in which not only does he imagine the lives of women who have been abandoned by, I mean, some really shoddy men in Greek myth, but he, you know, each of these women's voices is different. And I know this because when Britain was locked down the first time in 2020, do you know the story of how Pliny the Younger survives the eruption of Vesuvius? Yes? Reading books, exactly. So Vesuvius erupts and Pliny the Younger's uncle, Pliny the Elder, says, shall we go and get a bit closer? And Pliny the Younger says, no thanks, I'm reading Livy, a history book. I'll stay here. And I have for many years, I mean, probably decades, mocked Pliny the Younger for this, saying, what kind of person, when the world is ending, it's like, no thanks, I'll just sit here reading, you know, about the Battle of Cannae. And the answer is me, I am that person. Because when the world was ending and London was locked down, I didn't know really what to do. And so I thought, oh, I'll read one of Ovid's Heroides every week, and then I'll make a little video about it, and we'll share it online, and we'll call it Ovid, not COVID, because duh. And so that's what I did. And it's like, oh, okay. So for 16 weeks, I made, you know, so I read the Heroides reasonably recently by my standards, and I read all of them in Latin. And the voices of these women, there are 16, as I said, well, 15, and then 3 sets of paired ones, so 21 in total. But the voices of these women are so different from one another. You know, some of them, it's just an extraordinary piece of writing, of imagining the lives of women and imagining what the Greek myth looks like. So when people ask about that, I think the first time I really see it, this sense of what happens to a story when you take the bit that you know as a sort of male exploit and centre it on a woman's experience, is in the first of those poems, which is the letter from Penelope to, I would call him Odysseus, but Ovid obviously will call him Ulysses because, you know, Roman. And so she writes about a sequence in the Iliad which we call the Doloneia, right, in which Odysseus and his friend Diomedes, I think, go out at night under cover of darkness. They've just failed in Book 9 to get Achilles to agree to come back to fight with them. And so they go out to try and... He can't sleep because he's so stressed. They go out to try and level the odds. They find a Trojan scout coming the other way. They basically I think they torture him and then behead him, actually, to get... not everyone is nice. It is a war. And it's presented in the Iliad as this incredibly daring exploit, because it is. And it's, you know, it's kind of horrible. It reminds us that Odysseus is really smart, but he's utterly ruthless, something which, you know, I think often gets lost in terms of the sort of lovable rogue Odysseus. He's much scarier than he seems, and the version of him that we see in Euripides is, I think, much closer, actually, to the version that we see in Homer than people give it credit for. But anyway, a separate point and probably one for another day. But then when Ovid takes on the story from Penelope's perspective, she is furious about this sequence, because to her it looks, as it surely would to anyone waiting for their husband, the father of their child, the king of their home and of their people, the person on whom her status is entirely dependent, perhaps, at least according to Athene in the Odyssey, but perhaps she's freestanding, at least according to Telemachus in the Odyssey, but he is irritating, so I'd probably take her side. From her perspective, it looks foolhardy in the extreme, right? And so she is appalled that he does this. She says, I'm sure you were thinking a lot about your wife and child then. And, you know, at the time, so Odysseus takes 20 years, famously, to be away from Ithaca. So Telemachus, given that this was the 10th year of the war and it's going to take him 10 years to get home, Telemachus must have been 9 or 10, presumably, at that point. So she's right, isn't she, to be angry? At least she's right to feel angry and to express it. And Ovid is the one who notices that. Nobody was waiting for me to do it. You know, Mary Beard, Professor Mary Beard, Dame Professor Mary Beard, to give her all her titles, points out that classics are rediscovered by each generation for themselves. And of course that's true. Not only do we not carry over the knowledge of our foremothers and forefathers, but we don't carry over their views or their opinions. I think the reason that these feminist, by which I mean remembering that women are the same thing as human beings, versions of these stories are having such a strong moment now, is because essentially we've taken ourselves out of the 20th century's boring misogyny and the 19th century's boring misogyny, and we've gone back to looking at the Greek texts, which often, or Roman texts, which often center women, or at least accept that their roles are crucial and need to be heard, even if they're not the central character. It's our choice as modern people to raise the Iliad up onto a pedestal, but not do the same with Quintus Mannaeus. The fall of Troy would let us, were it to be studied in the same way, would let us focus on the story of Penthesilea, the Amazon warrior queen. It would let us focus a little bit more on the story of Memnon, the black prince who fights at Troy. And yet, you know, why do that where we can just have Greeks versus Trojans forever? Well, I have a reason for why. Because stories don't get worse when you know more of them. Generally, they get better. Nobody ever thought, oh, I really wish I knew less about this. That would be just great, is if I just knew just a tiny sliver of a story. Every work of art is going to encounter a tiny sliver of a story. The question is whether you all show the same tiny sliver from the same perspective. And why would you? You know, what would be the point in retreading that ground? So when people ask me if there are too many, or, you know, if we're going to get sick of them, yeah, maybe. I mean, that's bad news for me, because this is honestly the only thing I know. So I kind of hope not. But then I would guess I would just retreat to reading them all again, and that would keep me busy instead. I have to leave you time for questions, because otherwise, you know, we'll run out of time. And I'm still hoping to get to see the Vermeer tonight, so I can't stay too late. But thank you.
Which lost texts from the ancient world do you most wish had survived? Yes.
I can get it down to a final two, but I'm not prepared to choose between them, because it's both sides of my soul. So the comedian in me wishes that we had the comedy bit of Aristotle's Poetics, because it kills me that we treat comedy as a low art, while tragedy or opera is high art. And it's like, who made that rule? Not me. Comedy is incredibly difficult. The people who tell you that comedy is a low art are the people who've never willingly or knowingly made a person laugh in their lives. It's incredibly difficult. I would love to know what Aristotle had said about it, theorized about it, explained about it. And we've got 3 poems and some fragments of Sappho. Once there were 9 books of lyric poetry. As I would give almost anything I can think of. And one of those Sappho poems was discovered in my lifetime, in 2014, in everyone's lifetime in the stream. So we have half as many Sappho poems as we had in 2013 now. So I'd like to keep up that rate of discovery, but I don't love our chances. And we're waiting for somebody to create a really good algorithm to read those papyri from Herculaneum without destroying them. So if some scientists could get on that, and then some archaeologists could make sure they find some Sappho, that's really... I know it's an Epicurean library, but I like to think even Epicureans took the occasional moment off being delighted with themselves and their tranquility in order to read Sappho, the least tranquil of poets. So those 2, please.
Thank you. I was wondering, perhaps it's a far-fetched, but it seems to me like a cry for a new epic, this trend we're discussing. And that, in my perspective, I've read some of these books and I don't fulfill this cry. Perhaps it's just I'm solely crying for this. But I don't know whether it has been written, but let's say an epic about the Second World War or the First World War, something following up on Homer and Virgil, something larger than the interesting experiments we see now, but something with a bit more meaning, perhaps.
Do you want me to answer? Oh, well, I guess I think one of the things that we have to accept is that we maybe now encounter war differently from how the Greeks did. So the example I always tend to revert to, and I see no reason to differ, is the earliest Greek tragedy we have is Aeschylus's Persians, right? Which tells the story of the Persian War, a war in which Aeschylus himself had fought, so well within, and every single person in the audience would have lost someone, you know, at the audience of the Dionysia when this play was first performed. And so this play, one of the earliest whole play that survives to us, says, what was it like to fight in that war we all fought in as the other guy? What was it like to be the enemy? What kind of person is that? Not dehumanizing, but the opposite, rehumanizing a person who, by the very fact that they survived, these men must have had to learn to dehumanize. Yeah, this is hand-to-hand combat. Nobody is a winner. There's just a survivor at best, right? And then not only does it recenter the narrative in Persia rather than in the Greek world, but it centers it in the royal house of the king of Persia amongst his womenfolk waiting for him to come home. So this extraordinary thing is that Aeschylus basically invents drama because before him there's only been a solo performer and he invents the second actor. So he invents dialogue, which is quite a big contribution to art in general, I would say. But then he makes a requirement of empathy. You literally can't imagine. Imagine if when the Iraq War was happening or the Afghanistan War, if the first or major or only piece of culture that had come out of Hollywood at that time had said, oh, what's it like to be the other guy? What's it like to be the Taliban? Can you imagine that film winning the Oscar that Hurt Locker won? Me either. And yet that's something that the Greeks, who weren't, you know, thinking of themselves at an arm's length from war, but who had literally fought in it, it's just an extraordinary phenomenon that this kind of radical empathy was being employed at the very beginning of drama. And I'm not sure I think we have that same quality in relation to war now, partly because it does happen at arm's length, even before things like drone warfare made that a commonplace. There's a moment in, is it Fahrenheit 9/11, the Michael Moore film, where he interviews, I think there is only one congressman or maybe senator, but I'm afraid I can't remember which, who has a serving son in these wars. Every single other person who voted for the war doesn't have a physical blood relation at stake. And so that kind of distance, of course, in a way, gives us enormous power. We don't spend our whole lives worrying we're about to be invaded. It's excellent. I really enjoy it. And yet, it also means that we hold ourselves at a distance from these kinds of narratives. And so we ask, perhaps both of our art and of ourselves, something slightly different. We ask of ourselves something which trades perhaps more on imagination and less on experience. So are we perhaps ready to do that now with the First or the Second World War, because it's long enough ago? You know, even all our grandparents who had fought in those conflicts pretty well, I think, are dead. I don't know. I don't know if I think we have the distance, and I don't know if I think we have the capacity to carry ourselves from those conflicts without bringing the political ramifications of those conflicts with us. Certainly in the UK, I would say, very much not. We mythologize those wars. We do the exact opposite of what you're asking for. We have turned the First and Second World War into the Trojan War, rather than going the other way, I would say. You have to say when you want this.
The role of women, the patterns of patriarchy were obviously very different in the 21st century and the 5th century before the Common Era. Are there certain patterns of the patriarchy in ancient times that you would like to see reflected in these new female rewritings? Because as someone who has read both Circe and Achilles and has Circe and Song of Achilles and has started on Pandora's Jar, which I am quite enjoying, I do see lots of modern patterns of patriarchy and the way that they can also be implemented into the ancient times. But are there certain ancient patterns of patriarchy that you would like to see reflected in the literature that is coming out?
Do you want to do this?
That's right. So I think what you're saying is that what these books do is they kind of project what's happening today onto ancient myth. Is that the point you are making, or?
Sort of.
Yeah.
Yes, partially. I can see some ancient patterns of patriarchy in these books about ancient times, but also some modern projections. And I was wondering if there was some, the context of these works is very much grounded in the ancient times and the ancient patriarchy. And I was wondering which elements of that time and that context would be most interesting to explore in the rewritings.
Right. Well, of course, yeah, it really depends on what you want to do. I mean, if you look at the way the Greek dramas, as we've now just heard, retell the story of the War of Troy, I mean, that's already something which gets focalized by the Greeks of the 5th century, which might have gotten the values which were in place in, let's say, Bronze era Greece wrong. And it's always, I think that's the thing about Greek myths. It's always taking story patterns and looking at them through your own eyes. And as Natalie just said, I think every generation has its own new view, a new version of these stories. So I'm not so sure you could recover what it was like, I mean, if that's what you mean, to live in ancient Greece and to feel the world as it was felt by these people living at that time. I mean, you can, of course, try. That would be more like a historical reconstruction, perhaps, than a rewriting of a myth. So, yeah, that would be my answer. But, yeah, I don't know if you feel different about that.
There are moments when I realise I've been probably spending too much time reading Greek things and not enough time in the actual world, where I write something and then, my editor will come back and say, but why would anyone think this? And I'm like, but why wouldn't you know that? And you realise that it takes a lot of effort to kind of strip back the modern world when you're trying to kind of immerse yourself in these texts enough to imagine them. And you can't ever fully, of course. I will always be a 21st century woman writing these books for a 21st century audience. And that's as it should be, and I can't pretend anything else. But there are times when I find that the kind of unspoken assumptions in Greek sources and the unspoken assumptions now are so different. It feels like crashing into a wall, It's like, wait, what? And generally, I think with patriarchy, we're pretty alive now to the idea of what it means when men have supreme power over women. And in ancient Athens, for example, that was true. You literally had the power of life and death over your women folk, but also over your children, not all of whom were female. And so we do get, in Rome even more so, we do get stories of patriarchs exerting their patriarchal power against younger, less powerful men. And I feel like that element of the patriarchy has been almost completely lost. We tend to use patriarchy as a sort of shorthand, and I'm as guilty of it as anybody, meaning basically men have 9/10 of the world's wealth, suck it up, guys. It's a little irritating. You're going to have to accept we're going to point that out. But actually, of course, the vast majority of the world's men do not have 9/10 of the world's wealth. They're not doing so great either. And so it seems to me that the missing element of the story at the moment is probably class. And it's very, very tempting to think that because they had slavery in the ancient world and we don't have slavery, by which, of course, I mean there are more enslaved people in the world now than there were in the ancient world. I realise the population is larger now, but there is a vast enslaved population. It's simply that we don't register it or talk about it, as indeed often didn't the Greeks. But when they do, Aristotle, for example, Plato, we find their assumptions appalling. It's like, oh my God, how could Aristotle, so smart in other ways, think that people were essentially slavish and that's why they became slaves? What? And yet we live our lives now knowing that that mindset proliferates all over the world. And so if there was something I could bring in, I think it would be a way of both highlighting and interrogating those assumptions, which I feel were made so simply. And I mean, you know, nobody questions the existence of slavery in the ancient world. Not Socrates, not Jesus, not anybody. But I do feel like there's sometimes a kind of glib assumption that because we, by which I mean people who can afford to buy books on a nice day in Amsterdam, don't know any slaves, that there isn't slavery now. Of course, we should be thinking about this kind of powerlessness. It's also the case, of course, in terms of wealth, that the disparity is much worse now. You know, even in the most unequal society in the ancient world, probably imperial Rome, where you have this theoretically pyramidal structure, but it's not really a pyramid. It's sort of like one of those spikes you put letters on, right? It's like that, one person right at the top, and then really, 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 really narrow until here, and then everyone else, and then, you know. And so it's closer to that. But now, there are literally thousands of billionaires in the world. The richest person that anyone talks about in first century Rome is Narcissus, I guess, the freedman of Claudius. And he is worth, I did do the sums on this once, but he's worth something like 500 million sesterces. It's about, I don't know, 750 million euros. I mean, nothing like a billion is what I'm saying. And yet now there are multiple people who are much richer than him. A man who was like a kind of cartoon punchline for being incredibly, ridiculously rich. We never talk about that element of things, and I wish that we would.
Are there any ancient perspectives you would love to see written, or if they are already written, you would love to see some expanding on, that maybe you haven't planned on writing yourself or are writing yourself?
I never really plan anything until it kind of bites me, and then I do. So I didn't expect to write Stoneblind. And then I wrote a chapter on Medusa for Pandora's Jar, which has 10 chapters on 10 different women. And man, I was so angry when I finished it. And normally I'm quite angry as I go along. You know, I kind of write in a position of sort of tempered rage at all times. That's why I spend the time I'm not writing kickboxing. And that's fine. And then I finished writing, and I was like, I'm furious at what happens to her within her myth. I'm furious at what happens to her myth. I'm just really, really cross. And I thought, well, if you're this angry, you owe her a novel. You know, that's the truth of the matter. That's how it goes. And so 90,000 words later, I was like, yeah, okay, now I'm not so angry. Good. Good talk, everyone. Well done. And so, yeah, my next book that comes out will be the sequel to Pandora's Jar. So that's Goddesses. And that's been lovely to write. I like to alternate novels and non-fiction so that I recover from the emotional trauma of writing the novel by having a lovely, you know, relaxing walk around a different type of patriarchy. But the next novel will be Medea. So, yeah, I know. So I'm going to have to spend like a year or so murdering children, and we'll see. We'll see how that goes. I always like to reassure audiences at this point that I don't have children, and nor did I ever. So don't worry, it's fine.
Do you have a favorite mythical character or figure, or in other words, is there a mythical figure you favor based on ancient sources instead of later interpretations?
I am a serial monogamist in all things. So I always love the next one the most, I'm afraid. So the whole time I was writing Stone Blind, it was Medusa all day long. Man, I woke up with her, I went to bed with her, I never left her. And Athene, even though she's monstrous often in Stone Blind, I just love her. And people are like, how could you make her so mean? It's like, A, it's in the Greek, and B, I still like her. I don't know what you want me to say. I know she's terrible. I know, but I can't help it. And so, yeah, it probably is Medea. That's the first Greek play I saw performed. I've probably seen it 25 times, I think, 30 times maybe since then, including the most extraordinary Dutch language production that we were talking about. I was like, I'm going to need a minute, everyone. It was just mesmerising. I was so ready not to like it, at the start. I was like, oh, sure, she's mad. She's coming out of a lunatic asylum. Yeah, whatever. And then 90 minutes later, I was literally standing on my feet going, this is one of the best things I've ever seen in the theatre. And so, yeah, I think it's probably... I wrote my dissertation on it. It was the first Greek play I think I read in Greek, maybe the second. My dissertation was on Greek women who commit infanticide in the work of Euripides, Hecate, Medea. Not many other people to talk about, sadly, all dead. So, yeah, it probably is Medea. But that, I feel like I've been circling this myth for the longest time, because I wrote a chapter on her in Pandora's Jar, and I've been building to writing this novel. But it's like, where are the gaps, Because when somebody's written something Euripides Medea is the best play in any language, full stop, as far as I'm concerned. It's those two monologues, the one at the start and the one in the middle, I don't know. I don't know how I'm going to get around it. I don't know what I'm going to do. Don't ask me this question. I can't answer it. It's clearly Medea, and yet I don't know. One of us is going to be still standing in a year and a bit, but I can't promise it will be me. I like her chances, in truth.
Okay, this one's for Natalie as well. You already mentioned your next book, which will be about Greek goddesses, I believe. Was there anything in particular that you decided you wanted to write about this, that you wanted to explore this topic more, something you stumbled upon that was like, oh, this is going to be what I'm going to be writing about now?
You know what happened is, honestly, and this is, I know you're not supposed to ever say this, but Pandora's Jar sold way more copies than anyone thought it would. Because everybody sort of went, oh, yeah, do a nice non-fiction book to recover from those last 3 novels. And I was like, yeah, I'll do that. And my publishers were super nice about it. They were like, yeah, that would be lovely, Natalie. And then we'll just whack it out. It came out October 20. So the shops were closed in the UK. People just bought it online, I guess. And then, the Americans, again, ships had done quite well there. And they were like, oh, yeah, maybe. And then it was number 2 in the New York Times bestseller list. And it was like, what just happened? And people kept interviewing me saying, so obviously when you wrote your book about Greek myths, you knew it was going to be a bestseller. It's like, when I wrote my book interrogating the way that we've looked at Greek myths from a feminist lens, I honestly didn't see it as a big bestseller, sort of assuming kind of the opposite would happen. So my publishers were really excited when I told them I was happy to do a volume 2. And I chose the characters in Pandora really arbitrarily. I missed out Ariadne because I thought it would be more interesting to write about Phaedra, essentially because Hippolytus exists as a play, rather than because Ariadne isn't interesting. I just realised I would rather write about Euripides than Catullus, which is what I would have done for the Ariadne story. But it could equally well have gone... I didn't flip a coin, but I might as well have. It wasn't a difficult or protracted decision. It's like, who's cool? Yeah, she'll do. And I've still got terrible guilt for the women I didn't include, Ariadne, not least because in Ovid's version, she gets worried she'll get eaten by seals. Why didn't I want to write about that? I'm an idiot, and so on. And, Deianira, who, Sophocles' Trachiniai is such a strange play, but it would have been fun to write about. And yet, when it came to doing a second volume, I thought maybe I would do goddesses just because I'd had a lovely time fictionalising them in ships, and even more so in Stone Blind. But I realised there were loads of stories that I didn't, already know too much about. And that's the sort of joy for me, is being able to go and research and tell you what, go away, look things up, come back, tell you what I found. So all the Olympian goddesses get a go, but also some non-Olympian goddesses. And the most surprising chapter in the new book, which is called Divine Might in English. I'm not sure what it'll get called in Dutch yet. But the most surprising is Hestia, who was once a central goddess. You know, she is the older sister. You'd think she'd have some authority of Zeus. And every single sacrifice that's made in every single temple in the ancient Greek world, the first bit goes to Hestia. And I think if I asked people to name the Olympian gods, she wouldn't even get a mention. Dionysus replaces her, of course, because he's so flashy with his theatre and his wine. And so, yeah, rediscovering her was just a delight. But yeah, maybe when I do a third volume, I'll write about, what are they called again? Men? Maybe I'll write about men. I don't know, I haven't decided yet.